Here she is in the Galliano showroom picking out some clothes. The only thing she loves better than picking them out is wearing them.
Black velvet slacks.
Nancy Reagan is often compared to Jackie Kennedy and known for her love of high fashion. But she also has special projects. She adopts the Foster Grandparents Program, which encourages senior citizens to mentor children with special needs, visits Vietnam veterans in the hospital, and throws welcome home dinners for returning POWs.
I was upset that they weren't being welcomed home as they should have been. You know, they were heroes, and nothing was being done.
Behind the scenes, the First Lady is taking an even deeper role in making connections to further her husband's political career.
She was friends with the wives, but she was also calling these men and saying, you know, we need more money for the campaign, or what are we going to do about this, or why is Ronnie getting bad press on that, how can you help?
Nancy begins a practice that would continue for decades, calling Reagan supporters for information and advice.
Nancy Reagan swear had a phone attached to her ear. You could set your watch by her morning phone call. And what would we get? We would get the feedback from the other 100 phone calls she'd done in the last 24 hours to her friends, you know, around Southern California.
She also finds a friend and confidant in Michael Deaver, Governor Reagan's legislative aide.
We were very close, and we remained very close, always up until the day he died.
Together, they mold and shape Reagan's image.
When it came to the ins and outs of campaigning and imagery, she was very strong. Mike Deaver had become her accomplice early on in all of this. Together, they really helped take what Ronald Reagan was and sell it and then keep him on track.
In 1976, in an audacious move, Reagan challenges sitting President Gerald Ford for the Republican Party nomination.
Nothing quite like this has ever happened before in the history of American politics.
You had a convention that was almost split down the middle. It was not certain that Gerald Ford was going to win, and so feelings were running high, and Betty Ford and her family were sitting across the hall, and there started to be sort of, you know, dueling, you know, applause kind of thing between my mother and Betty Ford.
Now the Battle of the Wives has been joined again for the second night in a row. Nancy Reagan at one end of Kemper Arena, Mrs. Ford at the other end.
Will the delegates please take their seats?
It was a battle for the soul of the Republican Party, but it was also a battle for who the First Lady was going to represent. Would it be a forward-looking woman who would speak her own positions publicly, or was it going to be a woman that you never saw what she wanted other than she wanted this for her husband?
Ford wins the nomination, but by only a slim margin. Reagan emerges with a stronger national profile. When he runs for president 4 years later, the public still sees Nancy as a traditional housewife. But away from the cameras, she's deeply involved in the hiring and firing of campaign staff.
She knew her husband was very hesitant to fire people. He didn't like conflict. He was intensely loyal to people around him. But sometimes some of those people weren't serving him well.
I don't know whether it's just blocking things out or he just doesn't see things. He knew the overall picture, but he didn't know of all my meetings in the back halls and things like that.
She was the personnel director. She was the human resources department. She made decisions on who was going to be around him, from the campaign to the governor's office to the White House. That was her role.
On election night in 1980, Reagan trounces then-President Jimmy Carter, sweeping 44 states.
It was a very early call for Ronald Reagan as the next
The
president
results
of the
come
United
in so quickly, the Reagans are caught off guard.
States. It is a Reagan landslide.
I had the television turned up, and I heard it looks like Ronald Reagan has won. Well, I jumped out of the tub, grabbed a towel, knocked on the shower door, told Ronnie to get out, and he got out and he grabbed a towel, and there we are, dripping wet, listening to somebody say, Ronald Reagan is the next president of the United States.
The night before his inauguration, the new president-elect and First Lady are introduced to the nation with full regalia.
Distinguished visitors, guests, ladies and gentlemen. May I have the envelope, please? Well, this is the first administration to have a premier.
It might look like a night at the Oscars, but it's a curtain raiser for President-elect Ronald Reagan, called the All-Star Inaugural Gala, a first of its kind.
I'm so pleased that our First Lady, Nancy.
The same California millionaires who backed Reagan's campaign now run his inaugural committee and pay to televise the event. At the balls and parties that follow, the Reagans raised the bar on inaugural celebrations. All told, the festivities cost $16 million, 5 times what the Carters spent.
There was a lot of talk of this being a Republican Camelot, patterned after the Kennedy's administration and Nancy Reagan's admiration for Jackie Kennedy.
Dressed in designer wear, this new First Lady brings a sense of high fashion and formality to the White House.
There are numerous stories in newspapers about the style of Nancy Reagan, talking about the way she dressed, how she would redecorate the White House.
While the public sees a First Lady focused on style and design, behind the scenes she takes part in selecting her husband's key advisors. The president wants the more conservative Ed Meese as chief of staff, but Nancy Reagan advocates for the more moderate James Baker.
She was in all the major personnel decisions. I would never have been in the Reagan White House had it not been for Nancy Reagan. I'm quite confident of that.
Baker chooses Nancy Reagan's old friend Mike Deaver for his deputy, and Deaver becomes her conduit to the West Wing.
Baker had a perfect understanding that being on the good side of Nancy Reagan was important to him getting his job done, and he used Mike Deaver for that purpose.
Those who know her say Nancy Reagan's primary goal is her husband's success.
The most important thing that Nancy Reagan did as First Lady was to see that her husband was surrounded by people who would bring out the best in him.
For the most part, she tended to favor people that were more moderate. But she also realized her husband had to deal with the Democratic Congress, and the moderates would be better able to push his program through.
But nearly 70 days into this new administration, the unthinkable happens.
My Secret Service guy said there's been a shooting, but don't worry, the president is all right. Well, I'm starting for the elevator, and they said, but he's all right, he hasn't been hit. And I'm still starting for the elevator, and I say to them, you either find me a car, or I'll walk.
As shots ring out, a Secret Service agent pushes Reagan into the car. The president is removed from the scene so quickly that no one knows if he is injured. Just minutes after he is admitted to the hospital, Mrs. Reagan arrives.
And Mike Deaver was waiting, and he said, well, he's been hit. No.
6 bullets had been fired by lone gunman John Hinckley. White House Press Secretary Jim Brady, a local police officer, a Secret Service agent, and the president had been shot.
I've never seen anybody so white, really white. That was when he said, honey, I forgot to duck.
The early indications were that his condition was not critical.
Although the bullet lodged inches away from Reagan's heart, the seriousness of his injuries was downplayed.
He's emerged from this experience with flying colors and with the most optimistic...
All people were being told was, honey, I forgot to duck. You know, that's what they were being told, so they obviously just assumed that he was okay. He wasn't okay. I almost lost him.
The shooting has a profound effect on the First Lady. Already a worrier, she becomes more protective of her husband.
Every time he went out the door, I don't think I took a deep breath until he got back.
In her anxiety over her husband's public appearances, Nancy Reagan turns to astrology. She directs the president's deputy chief of staff, Mike Deaver, to adjust the president's schedule according to forecasts from the astrologer. Years later, when the press finds out, it's big news.
In many ways, it's much to do about nothing. Because I don't know of any instance where any policy was changed on the basis of astrological charts, or any personnel decision was made based on astrological charts. It all had to do with scheduling.
After the president recuperates, the First Lady turns her attention back to redecorating the White House.
It really looked awful. The wooden floors, the painting, everything needs to be done to make it look the way it should have looked.
Mrs. Reagan proudly raises $800,000 in private donations for the facelift. Most of the money goes to redecorating the second-floor residence, including the dressing room and the master bedroom. Along with the new decor comes a set of china worth $200,000, also privately donated.
We haven't got enough china to serve a state dinner, so we got china. The White House had to have china, for heaven's sakes.
During their first term, the Reagans throw 34 state dinners. There is always a mix of Hollywood and politics.
I loved having state dinners. I loved it. They were fun. You could ask anybody you wanted to, and they would come. So it was a wonderful way to meet other people, and a lot of business can get done at those dinners, too.
What she's trying to do is sort of like what Mary Todd Lincoln did during the Civil War, is make the White House a reflection of the power and the glory that is the United States.
But with Americans losing jobs and the president cutting programs like welfare, the Reagan style becomes a public relations problem.
It was very, very elegant, but in some people's eyes it was too elegant in a time in which a lot of people were hurting.
By the end of 1981, Mrs. Reagan's approval ratings are among the lowest ever for a First Lady. And with a women's movement now in full force, some see her as out of touch with the times.
It does seem to a lot of people she's moving the role of First Lady back to maybe the 1950s, where the main responsibility of the First Lady is to handle entertaining.
Unlike her predecessors, Mrs. Reagan had made it clear she did not support the Equal Rights Amendment.
A lot of feminists ask, is she going to play any role at all in pushing women's issues the way that Betty Ford and that Rosalind Carter did?
I'm not going to be like anybody else. I'm going to be Nancy Reagan. So I'll push the things that I'm interested in.
In 1982, the First Lady launches an anti-drug campaign called Just Say No.
Nobody wanted me to do that. They said it's a real downer. You don't want to do that. I said, yes, I do. Because by that time, I was finding out from home, a lot of my friends' children had gotten involved, and many of them had committed suicide.
She felt this was something that was her. something that she could really identify with. And then when you saw her with kids, and you saw her hugging them and them hugging her, and this was a different kind of Nancy Reagan than some people thought they knew about.
The First Lady also starts to poke fun at herself, making jokes about how she's portrayed in the media.
There's now a picture postcard of me as a queen. Now that's silly, because I never wear a crown. It messes up your hair.
But her big move comes later at the Gridiron, a private press corps dinner. Mrs. Reagan surprises everyone wearing a ragged costume and singing Second-Hand Clothes, a parody of her love for high fashion.
When she came out, people just couldn't believe it. They just howled and howled and howled because they were breaking their own self-created image of who Nancy Reagan was.
While the public has one view of the First Lady, the staff inside the White House see another.
She was really his protector. She could read people very, very well. She had a good feel for politics, and she was really the indispensable person. She could nudge and gently cajole, find a way to move the president forward.
Ronald Reagan had begun his presidency at a time when fear of a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union was palpable. As a staunch anti-communist, he believes the U.S. can negotiate with the Soviets only from a position of strength. He initiates one of the biggest peacetime defense buildups in American history. This and his strong anti-Soviet rhetoric alarmed European allies and sparked protests at home. Some call him a warmonger.
Nancy's feeling was that Ronald Reagan's motto was peace through strength, and that sometimes the right wing forgot the peace part. And she wanted to make sure that he went down in history as a peacemaker, not someone who started another war.
She was always in favor of a more centrist approach to governing. For one thing, she thought we should deal with the Soviet Union, not just refuse to talk to them.
In Reagan's first term, there is a deep divide between those who have a hawkish stance toward the Soviets and those who want to negotiate with them. While James Baker and Secretary of State George Shultz want to sit down with the Russians, National Security Advisor William Clark does not.
She was very much opposed to Bill Clark. She wanted him out of there because she felt that it was interfering with Reagan's efforts to open up better relations with the Soviet Union.
Nancy Reagan enlists other moderates in the administration to make William Clark's life miserable as National Security Advisor.
The First Lady also maneuvers to get the President and George Shultz to meet alone, away from the influence of other staff members.